My name is Bogdan Prokopovych. Thank you for coming to this talk. I will talk about stakeholder management. So stakeholder management is one of those terms that we hear a lot, and very often while we talk about the need for stakeholder management, we don't know what to do next, right? We need to manage expectations of stakeholders. We need to, and you guys, you think, if I were to ask you who are your stakeholders, you probably would give me all sorts of examples. Parents, loved ones, teammates, your co-workers, right? Employees and so on, right? So people around you, your professors, they're all stakeholders, right? And while we kind of all assume we're on the same page that these are the important entities in our life, what do we do next, right? And so today I'll talk about stakeholder management if we were to step in the shoes of a corporation, of an organization. And what I will do, I will start at the macro level with very macro concept, and then we'll look at the specific cases. So have you heard about this? I think it was in 2018, the CEO of one of the large asset management company, right, that invests in private companies, right? So it has a lot of funds invested in different companies, wrote a letter that made lots of ripples throughout the industry. And in that letter, he emphasized for the need to pay attention to social causes, environmental causes, and he used this term stakeholder capitalism, and that created a lot of debate what stakeholder capitalism is, right? So to start very broad, what is the stakeholder capitalism and how it relates to other concepts, right? So right now we are speaking at a very kind of theoretical macro. If I were to ask you who are these figures, probably it's hard to tell, right? Except some of them. Like usually people recognize the one on the top left, Karl Marx, right? So these are different types of capitalism, right? And labor capitalism. So all of them, why we separate them in different kind of worldviews, because they all operate on different assumptions. And labor operates on the assumption that there is a struggle for resources between bourgeoisie and between the labor, right? Investor capitalism, and it's economist Milton Friedman who wrote a piece that also made an impact on the industry, of how industry perceives sustainability. Investor capitalism operates on the assumption that the companies should pay attention to their bottom line, right? To maximize their shareholder value, right? All the rest is not social value. The social value that they create is maximizing the benefit of their principles. Then we have entrepreneurial capitalism. So this is Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter, if you ever talk about innovation, that's the gales of creative destruction come from Joseph Schumpeter, who used to live in so he wrote this famous book in 1946, I think, and there was a paragraph about gales of creative destruction, destroying the old ones, creating new ones, and now everyone who gets innovation-related funds or engages in innovation economy usually talks about Schumpeterian rents and so on. So the assumption of entrepreneurial capitalism is that we focus on the role of the entrepreneur. There's something about the entrepreneur that it's not only that the resources matter or external environment matter, is there something about the person who manages those resources, who configures them in a particular way that that works well. Government capitalism, Keynesian economics, you probably have heard about, right? So Keynesian economics, the idea of Keynesian economics that the economy is like a garden, and we need to have a gardener. And government intervention is the role of the gardener So we need to get rid of the weeds. We need to manage which kind of species we grow. And that's my favorite type, because again, I'm a management faculty. I teach management courses, managerial capitalism. And Alfred Sloan actually was a manager, and he was the first manager in General Motors who brought it out of obscurity and made out of GM, made it a formidable competitor to Ford, and even overtook. And the idea was that at that point, when the technology was at the automotive technology was developing, he figured out that we don't have all cars to look the same, to be Model Ts, but we can have different colors, we can have different shapes, we can have different. So that's and then comes this scholar who's considered to be father of stakeholder theory. So everything that whenever we talk about stakeholder capitalism or stakeholders, Edward Freeman from University of Virginia is usually cited, right? It's very simple definition of stakeholders, but that's what we usually, and the idea, again, the assumption of stakeholder capitalism, that we all have rights, that comes with obligations, and obligations to stakeholders, obligations to the environment, and so on, right? So that's, if we kind of like going back to this letter, this is where stakeholder capitalism kind of comes in, right? But then if we were to define, so who are stakeholders and why they're important, right? And are they important? Of course they're important, right? But what's the empirical evidence for corporations? Just a few studies. So this is one study where colleagues, a group of scholars, what they've done, they've coded interactions between stakeholders, and negative, positive for gold producers, right? And gold producers that own multiple gold mines, right? And what they figured out that, what they've done, they've created an index of positive and negative interaction with stakeholders based on the news, based on press releases, and so on. And what they found that there is a statistically significant difference that contributes to the valuation of those assets by shareholders, right? So interaction with stakeholders are important for the value of the firm that market places. Then also in terms of risk, right? If we were to look at the standard proxy of how do we interact with stakeholders, well, we create some kind of policy. And policy in businesses, usually it's a CSR policy, corporate social responsibility policy. And here's a study that looked at difference of companies engaging in corporate social responsibility and their probability of being sued, right? And again, it's kind of intuitive, but what they found empirical evidence that suggests, yes, if you are engaged with stakeholders, you're less likely to be sued. And if we look at just separate cases, Cape Wind. Anyone from Cape Cod here? So anyone have heard about Cape Wind, right? So this is, again, Cape Wind is a very interesting case. And Cape Wind Associates, Jim Gordon, like whenever he spoke, always was bitter, right? Because he was really had a hard time starting out this wind turbine park off the coast of Nantucket, right? And why? It wasn't, the business model was sound. There was a community that was ready to take on that electricity. Well, one can argue maybe they were too early to the market, right, in the US. But also there were too many stakeholders that were vocal, that were powerful, that didn't let him succeed. And even though I think it went like for a decade, there was always some kind of permit that was missing, and at the end of the day, it just foiled because they, So that didn't materialize. Whereas there are other offshore wind parks that have been started, but have been started later, right? And one could make an argument, well, maybe they managed the stakeholders differently, or maybe their stakeholders were less against the company. So again, stakeholders are important. You remember the recent controversy, relatively recent controversy, when Amazon was thinking of headquarters, and one of the places where to put headquarters was in Queens. And I have a colleague, co-author, and a friend who lives in Queens, and he actually thought it was. He wanted, again, he works in a business school. He wanted Amazon to come in, right? But there were plenty of people who thought they didn't feel like they were consulted on, that they were. That their opinion was taken into account when that decision was made. And clearly, if the company like Amazon comes into the community of Queens, things will change, right? Traffic patterns will change, employment will change, property values will change. And again, those were not necessarily the shareholders that impacted the business model, but actually stakeholders. So if we were to, okay, so now what we've talked about, stakeholder capitalism, we looked at different examples why stakeholders matter. So if we were to define it, and remember that picture of the Ed Freeman who defined stakeholders. So this is a very simple definition, right? And I guess the beauty is in its simplicity. But when we define stakeholders, it's someone who influences your objectives, or you influence their objectives. Right? Achievement of those objectives. A group or an individual who can be influenced or can influence the achievement of certain objectives by an organization. And there is also a discussion, it's more a philosophical discussion, should environment be considered a stakeholder, right? So stake is an interest, and stakeholder interests, the nature, right? All these different configurations of interest of different groups of stakeholders. So this is the definition. But then if we were, this comes the analysis of stakeholders. So stakeholder analysis is, again, it's an interesting exercise to do. Imagine that you have a sound business model, right? So you have a revenue model, you have a technology that works, you really, you know what you're doing. But then you want to think, if we introduce this technology, what would community think, right? Would they be against it? Would we be disclosing something that we shouldn't? Like, let's say you're developing an app. An app will collect some information and will disclose it, right? And while you know that the technology will work, you have customers, you have people who are willing to support you financially, and you have a prototype, but you haven't actually tested on the community. You don't know who will be for, who will be against, right? So these are the model usually used to think about who are important stakeholders. And saliency is actually the word for importance of stakeholders. Who are the most salient stakeholders? And the salience is defined in ability to draw attention to an issue of interest. So it is a function of three large factor kind of like variables, right? So one is power, an ability to wield influence by marshalling resources, enforcing norms, or taking advantage of social capital. So if you think in the analysis of the stakeholders, it's up to your team to define how that power is exercised. Is it giving funds? Is it creating regulations? Or is it having access to having a very large Rolodeck, right? Having lots of social capital. So one of the proxies of the power in this type of exercise is the centrality, degree of centrality. How many connections does the person have? Then legitimacy is another large factor. Having a claim on firm's activity, compliance with which gives the firm a moral license to operate. So who is a legitimate? So for example, if we go to If we go to Cape Wind, those stakeholders, the property owners, was one of the coastal property owners were the ones who really were against having the 130 or 90 wind turbines in the Nantucket Sound. And are they legitimate stakeholders? Yes. Why? Because they have the property value can be impacted. There is other costs, right? Not necessarily the monetary cost that they may incur as a result of that wind park being created there, right? So legitimacy. Whereas there could be stakeholders with lower legitimacy, just if they. If you think about someone who lives in Cape Cod can make a more legitimate argument why we should or why we shouldn't have it, compared to someone who comes from another country and argues that, well, we need to have offshore wind park in the United States, right? So this and the third factor is urgency, right? So an example that we usually cover in my class is a pharmaceutical company. And they are trying to get a license to produce genetically modified rice. And they have different stakeholders. And for some stakeholders, it's very urgent. For venture capitalists that funded that firm, it's extremely urgent, right? Because that's their objective. For the employees to get that permit, that license, is super important. But for USDA, it is important, but it has a lot of other things to consider, right? For FDA, right? In the age of COVID, they have all these vaccines to work with before they actually get to to consider the case of the company that, like how it will impact human health, if they grow that genetically modified rice compared to, authorizing COVID vaccines. So again, there are different. So if we think about the salience is a function of power, legitimacy, urgency, and if you could have a slider, they would have a different for each of the stakeholders. And this is how you could create a spreadsheet of stakeholders and think of how we can prioritize, right? And again, why do we need to prioritize? Well, because we always have scarce resources. We are limited on time. We are limited on funds. There's always a limitation, right? And you want to prioritize top 10, top 5, something that matters for a particular situation. And if we were to think about stakeholders, can we look at the different types? Well, here's the stakeholders that have a very close relationship, like they engaged in transaction. Shareholders engage in transaction by providing capital, right? Owning the company. Suppliers engaging in transaction of supplying raw materials, supplying labor, right? Employees, creditors, customers. So there is some kind of relationship that we can actually code. But then there are a lot of other organizations where we do not have that observable link. But at the same time, they're super important. And from the cases above, we see that these organizations can be the ones who can bring down a sound business model, right? So one of the typologies that we could use is used in the field. These are the market stakeholders. These are the non-market stakeholders. And when we talk about, all companies usually engage in different strategies, right? Strategy of low-cost strategy, differentiation strategy. But then there are non-market strategy. Non-market strategy, this is the stakeholder engagement, stakeholder management, right? How do we manage our relationship with the religious organizations, with the social environmental activists, local communities, and so on? So, so again, we started kind of very macro, and we are going down into specific cases. Here's just a specific stakeholder map. If you Google, if you search, there are all sorts of stakeholder maps, right? And again, they exist not for the lack of trying, but for every company faces a different picture, right? And all all these. Every company has a different problem, right? Even if even organizations dealing with eradicating a disease or the problem of hunger in one area, it can be different in Western Massachusetts, and can be different in elsewhere in the world, right? So that's why the again, a lot of organizations engage in this type of exercise. Like if you think about vaccine adoption, there needs to be stakeholder exercise, right? Creation of an institute, scientific institute. Stakeholders get engaged. World Health Organization, with all the policies, they engage in this type of exercises. So one of if we just kind of separate the private sector from nonprofit world, one of the ways how companies have been communicating with stakeholders or engaging with stakeholders, corporate social responsibility. And corporate social responsibility is not necessarily a new concept, right? If you look at, if you start Googling, and again, or searching or using different search engine, there's an Ngram viewer. What Ngram viewer does, it's a Google-based technology. It searches for incidents of terms in Google Books, right? You know, everything that has been digitized. And if you plug in CSR, corporate social responsibility in quotations, you will see it will start about like 1940s, right? And it will go up. There will be a jump, then there will be a little bit of slump, but it will always be kind of like a trend upward starting. And again, corporate social responsibility is not necessarily a new policy. So one of the criticism of corporate social responsibility is, first of all, it's hard to define. What is it, right? And there are multiple definitions. One definition is sacrificing profits for social goods, right? Or producing, subsidizing goods that communities benefit. But then there's a lot of criticism of corporate social responsibility, that it's a greenwashing, that it's just a smokescreen for doing all those, for engaging in the strategies that are not good for the communities, but good for the bottom line, right? And one of the examples you probably have heard about is Volkswagen, right? So VW. And VW, if you look at their corporate social responsibility policy, it's very sound, right? It's it has a corporate social responsibility report. It hired people who were in charge of corporate social responsibility. But even though, despite that, they had like some managers, top managers, making a decision that it's okay to cheat on emission standards, right? So when the Volkswagen car was being tested for emissions, it was generating one level of emissions. When it was on the road, that device kicked in and completely, it was a different car, right? Or different technology with respect to how much emission they produce. And of course, in this day and age, things become, like we find out about those things, and the company has suffered as a result, right? So again, corporate social responsibility. So one of the corporate social responsibility is that one of the views, one of the criticisms of corporate social responsibility goes back to investor capitalism, right? That operates on the assumption that we should pay attention to what the owners want, what the owners consider important. And Milton Friedman in 1970 wrote this article in New York Times Magazine, and it keeps 2023. We still, when we want to criticize corporate social responsibility, we invoke his argument saying, well, it's, I have a quote here. So in most of these social responsibility cases, what is in effect involved is some stockholders trying to get other stockholders or customers or employees to contribute against their will to social causes favored by the activists. Insofar as they succeed, they are again imposing taxes and spending the proceeds, right? So imposing taxes on someone who doesn't want them. And if you think Milton Friedman's argument is not that flawed, right? If we, again, for someone who's teaching sustainable enterprise, of course we want companies to engage in CSR. But here's what his argument is, that as individuals, we're not bad people, usually. We engage in philanthropy, we volunteer, we help others, right? We try to, try to be mindful about the environment. But organizations, it's artificially, socially constructed entities that the main role of them is in the society is to pay attention to the shareholders, shareholder value. And that's their social value creation, right? Paying attention to the bottom line. So if we were to kind of summarize when organizations engage in CSR, right? All the multiple studies that have looked into it, we can boil down to this six main reasons. Response to punitive regulation, right? So something happens, emission scandal happens, and all of a sudden companies become aware of it. In India, there was a regulation issued that companies with a certain level of revenues should engage in CSR, right? And when it's not costly, right, to engage in CSR, when something that is relevant, relatively easy to make it sound that we pursue corporate social responsibility. When it helps us reduce our business expenses, increase in revenues, thinking about, well, if we want to sell to increase our, reach out to different customer segment. Well, we can spin it as frame our product as the one that came out of the CSR kind of policy. Improving negotiating leverage over regulations when, let's say, a company wants to move in and move into a specific physical location, and having CSR in their kind of policy portfolio helps create a good image. And one of the interesting points is creation of entry barriers. So if you think about large corporations can invest, like VW, Walmart, they can invest in corporate social responsibility. A smaller company, it's much costlier for them in relative terms to engage in CSR, but at the same time, so it can be regarded as a barrier that keeps all those smaller companies out of the loop. So two other approaches there are, and again, we can talk about CSR we can just dig deeper and deeper into corporate social responsibility in different, in the argument for corporate social responsibility and against corporate social responsibility. So with CSR, one of the arguments against CSR, another argument against CSR, that it's always measured on the cost side, right? It's not part of the business model. It's something that we do extra. And there was an article that was published in Harvard Business Review that went viral, that created the entire industry of consultants, of people who measure social impact, infrastructure finance picked it up, equipment manufacturers, called creating shared value, right? So kind of shifting the argument from, well, how about if we look at all this corporate social responsibility, make it a part of the value proposition, right? Part of the central piece of business model. But again, that's a different topic and we can talk more about it. But then there are two other approaches. Another, how corporations speak with their stakeholders, and one is through certification, another is sustainability rating, right? And sustainability ratings have been discussed a lot recently. You guys have read article, and from what I could hear from the discussion, you've read it very carefully, which is great. Why I like that article, because it summarizes the current discussion of ESG, right? There was a moment of our infatuation with the ESG ratings, and now there's a lot of criticism, right? And again, there are proponents of ESGs. There are people who think that's another instance of corporate social responsibility. But let's look at some of other approaches to of corporate sustainability for social behavior. So let's look at the certification. So certifications are everywhere, and I usually ask my students to look at any of the. So probably your notebooks might have, or at some point had a little logo. Probably it was SFI, right? So if you at some point, maybe you when you purchased, you tore it off, but actually this might have it. Yeah, so it has a Sustainable Forestry Initiative. Yep, SFI. So SFI, sometimes it's one of those tear sheets that you just tear off right away. And these are the labels. And very often we don't pay attention to those labels, but sometimes we do, right? And so for example, if you buy seafood, you're very likely to see this you'll see a bunch of different certification, but this is one of the most dominant logos in the seafood industry, Marine Stewardship Council, and Forest Stewardship Council, Sustainable Forestry Initiatives is another kind of like main dominant. FSC is more prevalent in Europe, or used to be, and SFI, or Sustainable Forestry Initiative, is more in the US. So what is certification? So certification has to do with creating a standard and creating a signaling mechanism that how we adhere to that standard. And there are lots of standards that become mandatory to work in and it can be either regulation or it can be required by the community of organizations. For example, if you are a fishing company and you want to produce to sell your seafood through the network of Whole Foods stores, they need to be MSC certified, right? And similar, if we want to sell the notebooks through big box retailers such as Target, Walmart, very likely we will be required to have that that logo. So that's more at the tips of our fingers what we observe. But there are other things, other programs that do not necessarily carry a specific label, but they work in a similar way. In 1984, in India, Union Carbide plant, you may have seen a movie about it, you may have read about it. So there was a disaster that cyanide leaked there was an explosion in the company. And a lot of people died, a lot of people suffered the health effects over years. And what happened, and Dow Chemicals is one of the organizations, is that inherited, since they acquired Union Carbide, inherited that problem. And again, that's the whole situation has become a mess, right? Being a part of the American Chemistry Council, which is a large industry association in chemical industry, they, like Dow Chemicals, BASF, all these big integrated kind of like chemical manufacturers, they got together and they created this responsible care program, right? So responsible care, and what it does, it helps you prevent, helps minimize the risk of bad apples. Companies that wouldn't pay attention to safety standards, right? So, and to be able to benefit from all this, from information that you would be provided, from being in the club in that industry association, from lobbying efforts, right? You need to adhere, or the company needs to adhere to relatively rigid standards. And responsible care is one of those milestone programs that usually touted as a successful policy. But one of the criticism, going back to what all those reasons that I mentioned, if you think about Dow Chemicals that produces anything from fertilizers to pharmaceutical, right? But there are companies that have 50 people, and they are specialty chemical producers, right? In their value chain, whereas if you think about value chain from raw materials to the end consumers, and Dow Chemicals spans a huge chunk of it. But there are a lot of companies that have 50 people, but they work on some specific molecule, on some specific compound, right? And they work in different margins, but they also have different costs. And for them, it's much costlier to participate in a responsible care program than if we were to compare with the large corporations. Another, like these days, you probably have seen if you shop in a food store, right? Probably like if you just take randomly any product and turn it upside down, you will see this B corporation, right? So B, it's definitely a trend. A lot of companies want to get that certification. And there are two things. So it was created by B-Lab, B-Lab is a nonprofit. And B-Lab is an amazing organization. It's, again, we can spend the whole hour talking about it because it contributed to development of the certification. It helped create this legal form, the benefit corporation. But it impacted the fields such as impact investment, right? Here's a BCorp certified. So if you going away from the food products in the grocery store, you like to crunch numbers, you probably have used the R, language of R, or Python, or any other open source software. And this is one of the products that is highly popular, RStudio, and RStudio is a BCorp certified company. But it's not only BCorp certified, it's also a benefit corporation. It kind of is both. So here's it's from 2019. In this light, I'm very pleased to report that in 2019, RStudio became a Delaware Public Benefit Corporation, PBC, and a certified B Corporation, which means that our open source mission is codified into our charter and that our corporate decision must balance the interest of community customers. And you see they have the scores. Right? And I think this is from 2019, so I assume their score is 86, and maximum can be 200. And if you look at the data that's available for B-Lab certifications, it's upward trend, right? So we have more and more companies certified. We have in the US, this is where kind of like the main home for B-Lab certifications. If we look at the industries where B-Lab certifications happen, food, beverage, IT and software, management and financial consulting, marketing, communications. So these are the top 10 industries, right? And again, we can speculate why is that, right? Well, maybe it's less costly than it would be to certify something, like a steel manufacturer or something like that, right? So, or maybe steel manufacturers do not need B-Lab certification. They work in a different kind of certification realm. So why self-regulate? Similar, if we were to collect all those reasons, from anticipating economic benefit to avoiding regulatory burden, kind of like responsible care. If you've done this before, you are more likely to certify. If you are certified for quality control, you are more likely to adopt ISO 14,000, that is environmental certifications, and a number of others. I want to jump to, so here's another certification that is less formal, right? But it exists, and it's in Western Massachusetts. So all local products around Amherst get this local hero label, and the organization is CISA. That labels these, and this is my co-authors. We did a study on UMASS dining using the low category of local to talk to their stakeholders, to talk to students, to talk to local producers, to talk to other constituents. Let me jump right to the third approach, right? So we talked about CSR, we talked about certifications, and let's talk about ESG ratings, right? ESG ratings is a mature industry. If you look at all these, so these are the, someone kind of looked at all these programs that existed before, and it goes back to 1980, right? Like KLD data has been used by researchers for so long, right? And now we have, as you see, MSCI. So right now, if you look at the certification, we can count them on the fingers of one hand, right? Refinitiv, Sustainalytics, MSCI, right? The big producers. Probably I'm missing a few others. That article that you guys have read mentions it. And again, there's a lot of events that shows the consolidation of the industry. So all these ratings become more and more larger, right? More kind of institutionalized. And let me skip this. So how do we compare it to certification? How does it work? In certification, it's a voluntary regulation. So it's another oxymoron. Voluntary regulation, why would you want to regulate yourself, right? So, and companies choose to voluntarily submit, engage in this compliance behavior that is costly for financial resources, costly for time, and sometimes risky. But here, there's a third-party certifiers, right? Third-party organizations that look at company reports, at other data that's available, and they have their own in-house methodology that, and they rate it on ESG. And it used to be on the fringes, right? So if we look at those, like timeline, if you go to Yahoo Finance or Google Finance, you have to dig through like really deep below to find what are the ESG ratings. Now they are very prominent, right? So it becomes one of the mainstream products, and you have read about it, right? So what was the criticism? The criticism is that, well, it's another smokescreen, right? It's actually not smokescreen. It talks about the risk from the environment on the company, and not actually how risky the company is for the environment. And very often, when we don't know that, we assume that ESG, if someone scores really high on ESG, it's really good for the environment. And I think at this point, once we know more about ESG ratings, how they created, we realize that, well, we need to be educated consumers of that information. Again, here's a couple of instances, and I pulled it from last night from MSCI platform, and you read about MSCI. So here's Tesla. Tesla, this is how their ESG rating is reported, right? And these are the factors that contribute that, right? And for example, product safety and quality. What do you think? Is this E, is this S, or is this G? So E, environmental pillar, S, social, G is governance. So which one do you think? Social, yeah, exactly, it's social. Labor management, governance, right? And they're actually doing pretty good and pretty consistent, right? But one could think of plenty of other instances why Tesla, like leadership matters, right? There were plenty of scandals, especially recently with product safety. And if you, again, there are multiple reports, so if you start looking into MSCI, you start digging, and this is what we do in my class. Students pick two twins. One we call the poor performing twin. One is a high performing twin. The company that performs very well, so we should find two companies that are very similar, but perform differently on ESG. And then students go into the reports and look for clues why the analyst or analyst teams decided to assign particular rating. And it's very revealing to see what brings down or what brings up their scores. And one of the things so here's Tesla, here's Coca-Cola, right? And Coca-Cola has been on an upward trajectory. And if you think opportunities, nutrition, and health, right? Health and safety, product carbon footprint, E, governance, G, water stress, environment, packaging materials, waste, environment, product safety and quality, social, right? It's all upwards, right? So they are in the top 10%, right? Or 11% of the industry. But there are plenty of things like if you think of water stress of Coca-Cola compared to a local farm store, right? And here's another one, which is Facebook, right? Or Meta platforms. They started at triple B, which was okay, right? But then it was brought down significantly, and triple C, and now they're in the bottom of their. So one of the things that we usually have to pay attention to is we have to compare, when we compare those companies, we have to compare between apples and pears at least, right? And one of the things that, not oranges, environmental, social, governance, so think about your grade in a class. Usually it's some kind of weighted average that adds together to 100%. Here's the same, companies get a score, 30% on environmental pillar score. That's for Tesla. 37% on social governance pillar score, 33%. And if you think these are like those levers that we talked before about stakeholders, legitimacy and power and urgency, right? How much you can, like which policy, so we can introduce some policies that would go under improve our score in the social pillar. And this will be the effect that we would have, right? So 0.37. And similar here, but then if we think about Facebook, right? Environmental pillar is only 5%, where social pillar score is 53%. Governance pillar score is 42%, right? And again, it's as consumers, we usually do not pay attention to those, right? We just compare, oh, this is a good company because it scores very high on ESG, right? But compared to, there's always a question that needs to, when we talk about ESG scores, compared to what? There's always relative to companies. If you look at the companies that provide cruises, historically they've had very poor ESG ratings, but there's a variation among them, right? And when we compare Coca-Cola and Pepsi, they have a, even though, you know, as drinks we would compare them, right? But as companies, they have different footprint, and their distribution of the weights is different on E, S, and G. I think I've used up a lot of my time, so I'll stop and I can answer quickly any questions. And thank you for being good listeners in the first place. You had some interesting points when you discussed the article. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in B Corporation and the certification there. Could you explain it a little bit more?
Yeah, so B Corp, best explanation is an example. So I had a guest speaker, a hair salon that wanted to have a B Corp label. So they based in Holyoke, and they thought it was important for them and their customers to signal that value that they are B Corp certified. Companies provide information on, actually if we go to the slide. So B Lab has a wealth of resources. They have their own B Analytics suite. So based on how they, I know I have that slide, but usually it is how well they treat workers, how they engage with environment, what are their environmental policies, and a number of other, it's kind of like a questionnaire, right? And to questionnaire with the Likert scale questions. And at the end, it comes to some kind of standardized score, right? And I think by getting to 50, you get certified. below 50, you're not certified yet. You are on the way to get certified. And again, these things change dynamically, right? Depending who else working on the market. But these are the one of the kind of things that's important for B certification is the network effect, right? So why is it difficult to create your own label? Well, because you need to have enough people to subscribe to it. And for example, in this one, Marine Stewardship Council, it's a World Wildlife Fund and Unilever, very interesting partners that came together and have created it, right? One is the largest, one of the largest seafood sellers, right? Distributors, and one is that an organization with a mission that to advance the welfare of the wildlife, right? And at the same time, they figured out how to work together, and they created this dominant logo, dominant label. So these are the labels, and again, there are different degrees of how formal they are. Yeah.
I'm really unimpressed that Coca-Cola gets a high ESG rating when their main product is contributing greatly to obesity. How does that happen?
That's a good question, right? So these are the bright individuals like these were sitting together, poring over the and as you see, what contributed to the higher scores is the opportunities in nutrition and health, right? So they actually improved their score, and one could argue that improved compared to other CSD manufacturers, right? But it's and that's why, hence there's all these voices against using ESG or using ESG with being educated about how we use it, right?
I know we're at 6:30, but there are students in the ESG cafeteria, so I will invite you to stay afterwards for a few questions if you want to come up individually. There's a ton to talk about. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much. Thank you guys for listening.